Hi everyone, welcome back to Cosmo's Universe. From a very young age, the moon becomes quite a familiar sight in the sky. There's actually quite a lot to notice about the moon, but one of the most obvious things we usually observe is the way it seems to constantly change shape. These various shapes are called the phases of the moon and are pretty easy to understand once we look at the bigger picture. An important aspect to consider when thinking about the moon's phases is perspective. Perspective is the way in which an object's appearance alters as the angle from which we view it changes. And when the object is lit up with a bright light, the change in perspective can become more dramatic. This is exactly what happens when we observe the moon phases over time. The moon orbits the Earth about once every 29.5 days, as the Earth also orbits the Sun. The time period between each new moon, which I'll explain soon, is called either a synodic month or a lunar month. The Earth and Moon are lit up by the Sun, causing both to have daytime and nighttime sides. There's a line on both the Earth and Moon where day and night meet. This is called the terminator. We can think of the terminator as the day-night line. At the moment, the perspective from where we're facing the Earth and Moon is from a position somewhere out in space. The Sun is on the right from this position, so the daytime sides of the Earth and Moon are also on the right. So from this perspective, the Moon will look similar throughout its orbit around the Earth, with its daytime side always facing the Sun and its nighttime side always facing away. One thing that does constantly change, though, is the angle between the Sun, Earth and Moon. But of course, our actual viewing position isn't from out in space. We see the Moon from here on Earth. So depending on the angle of the Moon compared to the Sun, the Moon will appear differently as more or less of its daytime side becomes visible. Although the Moon goes through a continuous cycle, there are 8 specific phases that are defined by name. The cycle begins when the Moon is somewhere between the Earth and the Sun. This phase is called a new moon, where all of its nighttime side faces the Earth. From this position, the glare from the Sun will drown out the Moon's nighttime side, so new moon phases aren't ever visible from Earth. As the Moon orbits, the first visible phase is a crescent. From this perspective, the terminator looks like it's curved inwards. When the daytime side of the Moon increases in size, it's called a waxing moon, so this is specifically called a waxing crescent moon. The daytime side continues to grow until we see exactly half. Funnily enough, this is called the first quarter moon. The terminator now appears as a straight line. The Moon's daytime side continues to grow as the terminator now begins to curve outwards. This phase is called a waxing gibbous moon. When the Moon's position reaches opposite the Sun from Earth, now we can see all of its daytime side, which of course is called a full moon. The Sun and Moon are now on opposite sides of the Earth from out in space, so they'll also be in opposite sides of the sky for us here on Earth. During this time, the full moon will rise in the east as the Sun sets in the west. The Moon will then go through opposite phases, except this time, as less daylight becomes visible, it's called a waning moon. So these phases are waning gibbous, last quarter, and waning crescent, until we reach the start of our lunar cycle again with a new moon. There's a few more things we can notice during this lunar cycle. In the view from space we've been looking at, the Moon completes one lunar orbit in 29.5 days, which means that the Earth also rotates 29.5 times per lunar cycle. So as the Earth rotates from west to east, from Earth the Moon will look as if it's moving from east to west during the course of just a few hours. This is called the apparent motion of the Moon, and it's quite noticeable, similar to how you'd notice the Sun moving across the sky during the day. The Moon is also orbiting in the same direction as the Earth's rotation, but much slower. So from Earth, you can actually notice the moon moving from west to east across the sky night after night. This is called the orbital motion. New moons are always in the west, very close to the sun, whereas full moons are seen in the eastern sky. If you've ever looked at the moon through a telescope or binoculars, you may have noticed that only one side of the moon faces us. This is because the moon's rotational period equals its orbital period around the Earth. Astronomers call this phenomenon tidal locking, which also occurs with some other moons in our solar system. Although our moon is tidally locked to the Earth, it does wobble a little, causing small parts of the moon's far side to come into view. This wobble is called libration, which causes about 59% of the moon's surface to be visible from Earth. I'd like to finish on a tip regarding observing the moon through a telescope or binoculars. Although a full moon can look absolutely spectacular in the sky, especially when it's rising, through a telescope it won't look anywhere near as interesting as when it's at other phases. This has a lot to do with the angle at which the sun's light strikes things like craters or mountains. When we look at an object with the light source directly behind us, it won't cast shadows, making the object a little uninteresting to look at. In some cases, you might not even be able to tell exactly what it is you're looking at. But when the light comes from the side at an angle, the object becomes more defined by shadows, making it easier to see and far more interesting to look at. When we look at a full moon, the sun's light is coming from behind us, so very few shadows are cast. The best time to see shadows on the moon are during other phases. The longest shadows are always cast on or near the terminator, making craters, mountains and valleys much more interesting to look at. As the terminator gradually moves, different features are exposed, making the moon an incredibly rich object to observe. As you can see, there's more to the moon than first meets the eye. All you really need is a clear sky and a few minutes each day to notice what the moon's doing. Thanks again for watching and listening, and I'll see you next time in Cosmos Universe.